In the mid-1970s, a young neuroscience researcher named John Cacioppo was listening to his professors, some of the best in the world. When they tried to explain why human emotions change, they seemed to focus only on one thing: what happens inside your brain. They didn't look at what was happening in your life and ask whether that might be causing any of the changes in the brain they were discovering. It was as if they thought your brain is an island, cut off from the rest of the world and never interacting with it. So John asked himself, what would happen if, instead of studying the brain as if it were an isolated island, we did it differently? What if we tried to study it as if it were an island that is connected by 100 bridges to the outside world, where things are being carried on and off all the time as you receive signals from the world? When he raised these questions, his mentors were puzzled. You know, they told him, even if it were relevant, the factors outside the brain, that is, are not fundamental to change like depression or anxiety. And besides, they said it's just too complex to figure out. Nobody will understand any of this for 100 years or more, so we're not going to focus on it. John never forgot these questions. He puzzled over them for years, until one day in the 1990s, he finally thought of a way he might begin to study them in more detail. If you want to figure out how your brain and your feelings change when you interact with the rest of the world, you could start by looking what happens in exactly the opposite situation. When you feel lonely and cut off from the world around you, does that experience, he asked himself, change your brain? Does it change your body? He began with the simplest study he could think of. John and his colleagues gathered 100 strangers at the University of Chicago, where he was now based, to take part in a straightforward experiment that nobody had ever tried before. If you were one of the people taking part, you were told to go out and spend a few days just living your normal everyday life, only with a few little tweaks. You had to wear a cardiovascular monitor to measure your heart rate, and you were given a little beeper and some tubes. You left the lab on the first day of the experiment. Whenever the beeper beeped, which it turned out would happen 9 times a day, you would have to stop your everyday business and write down 2 things. First, you had to note how lonely or connected you felt. Second, you had to record your heart rate from the monitor. On the second day of the experiment, you went through the same process, except this time, when you hear the beeper, you'd spit into a tube, seal it, and keep it to hand it in to the lab. John was trying to figure exactly how stressful it is to be lonely. Nobody knew. But when you're stressed, your heartbeat goes up, and your salivia becomes flooded with a hormone called cortisol. So this experiment could, finally, measure how big the effect is. When John and his colleagues added up the data, they were startled. Feeling lonely, it turned out, caused your cortisol levels to absolutely soar, as much as some of the most disturbing things that can ever happen to you. Becoming acutely lonely, the experiment found, was as stressful as experiencing a physical attack. It's worth repeating, being deeply lonely seemed to cause as much stress as being punched by a stranger. John started to dig to see if any other scientists had studied the effect of loneliness. A professor named Sheldon Cohen, he learned, had carried out a study in which he took a bunch of people and recorded how many friends and healthy social connections each of them had. He then took them into a lab and deliberately exposed them, with their knowledge, to the cold virus. What he wanted to know was, would the isolated people get sicker than the connected people? It turned out that they were 3 times more likely to catch the cold than people who had lots of close connections to other people. Another scientist, Lisa Berkman, had followed both isolated and highly connected people over 9 years to see whether one group was more likely to die than the other. She discovered that isolated people were 2 to 3 times more likely to die during that period. Almost everything became more fatal when you were alone. Cancer, heart disease, and other problems. Loneliness itself, John was slowly discovering as he pieced together the evidence, seemed to be deadly. When they added up the figures, John and other scientists found that being disconnected from the people around you had the same effect on your health as being obese, which was, until then, considered the biggest health crisis the developed world faced. So John knew that loneliness has striking physical effects. But could it, he wanted to investigate next, also be driving the apparent epidemic of depression and anxiety? At first, this seemed like it would be a tough question to investigate. You can survey people and ask them three things. Are you lonely? Are you depressed? Are you anxious? Then you can match up the answers. If you do that, you always find that lonely people are much more likely to be depressed or anxious. That doesn't get us very far, because depressed and anxious people often become afraid of the world and of social interaction, so they tend to retreat from it. It could be that you become depressed first, and that in turn makes you lonely. But John suspected it could possibly be the other way around, that if you become lonely, that might make you depressed. So he started to seek the answer, using two very different kinds of study. To start with, he took 135 people who had been identified as highly lonely and brought them into his labs at the University of Chicago for a day and a night. They were given personality tests so extensive that John joked they might have been being sent off on a mission to Mars. What these tests found is pretty much what you'd expect. That lonely people are also anxious, have low self-esteem, are pessimistic, and are afraid other people will dislike them. The key now was for John to find a way to make some of them more lonely without affecting anything else in their lives, without doing anything that might make them panic or feel judged, for example. Now, how could that be done? He split his next experimental group into two, Group A and Group B, and then brought in a psychiatrist named David Spiegel to hypnotize each group. In turn, Group A, under hypnosis, was led to remember periods in their lives when they felt really lonely. Group B was led to remember the opposite, a time in their lives when they felt really connected to another person or to a group. After the subjects had been made to feel super lonely or super connected, they were made to do the personality tests all over again. John figured that if depression is causing loneliness, then making people feel more lonely won't make any difference. But if loneliness can cause depression, then increasing loneliness will increase depression. What John's experiment found was later regarded as a key turning point in the field. The people who had been triggered to feel lonely became radically more depressed, and the people who had been triggered to feel connected became radically less depressed. The stunning thing was that loneliness is not merely the result of depression, he told me. Indeed, it leads to depression. It was, John says, definitely had the starring role. But this didn't resolve the question. Lab conditions, John knew, can be artificial in all sorts of ways, so he started to research this question in a different way. As he made these discoveries, John began to ask, why? Why would loneliness cause depression and anxiety so much? He came to suspect there might be a good reason. Human beings first evolved on the savannas of Africa, where we lived in small hunter-gatherer tribes of a few hundred people or less. You and I exist for one reason, because those humans figured out how to cooperate. They shared their food, they looked after the sick, they were able to take down very large beasts, but only because they were working together. They only made sense as a group. Every pre-agricultural society we know about has this same basic structure. He wrote with one of his colleagues, against harsh odds they barely survive, but the fact that they survive at all they owe to the dense web of social contacts, the vast number of reciprocal commitments they maintain. In this state of nature, connection and social cooperation did not have to be imposed. Nature is connection. Now imagine if, on those savannas, you became separated from the group and were alone for a protracted period of time. It meant you were in terrible danger. You were vulnerable to predators. If you go sick, nobody would be there to nurse you, and the rest of the tribe was more vulnerable without you too. You would be right to feel terrible. It was an urgent signal. from your body and brain to get back to the group any way you could. So every human instinct is honed not for life on your own, but for life like this, in a tribe. Humans need tribes, as much as bees need a hive. That sense of dread and alterness triggered by being alone for too long evolved. Then John says, for a really good reason, it pushed people back to the group, that when they were with the tribe, they had an incentive to treat people well so they didn't get thrown out. A strong impulse in favor of connection, he explains, simply produces better outcomes for survival. Or, as he told me later, loneliness is an aversive state that motivates us to reconnect. This would help us to understand why loneliness so often comes alongside an anxiety. Evolution fashioned us not only to feel good when connected, but to feel secure. The vitally important corollary is that evolution shaped us not only to feel bad in isolation, but to feel insecure as well.